Imagine spending 10 years fighting the greatest war in history, only to discover that the journey home would be even more dangerous. A voyage where one mistake could cost an entire crew, where monsters lived beyond the horizon, where powerful gods controlled every storm, and where a single king would be forced to outwit giants, witches, and death itself. This is not just a tale of adventure. It is the legendary journey of Odysseus, a man who challenged fate, defied the gods, and refused to give up until he reached home. This is the Odyssey. For 10 long years, the greatest warriors of Greece had fought beneath its towering walls. Kings and heroes had crossed the sea seeking victory, and countless lives had been lost in the struggle. At last, through patience, courage, and the brilliant plan of a giant wooden horse, the long and terrible war came to an end. The flames of Troy rose into the night sky as the victorious Greek armies prepared to return to their distant homes. Among them stood Odysseus, the wise king of Ithaca. Unlike many other warriors, Odysseus was known not only for his strength, but for his intelligence. Time and again, his clever decisions had saved his companions when swords alone could not. It was his idea that had brought the great wooden horse inside the walls of Troy, ending a war that had lasted for an entire decade. Now, with victory behind him, his thoughts were no longer on battles or glory. They were fixed on home. Far across the blue waters of the Aegean Sea lay the small island kingdom of Ithaca. It was not the richest kingdom in Greece, nor the largest. Rocky hills, quiet forests, olive trees, and simple villages covered its land. Yet to Odysseus, no place in the world was more precious. There waited his faithful wife, Penelope. When Odysseus had sailed away to fight in Troy, their son, Telemachus, had been only a baby. 20 long years had now passed, 10 years of war, followed by years of uncertainty upon the sea. Telemachus had grown into a young man without ever truly knowing his father. Everything he knew came from stories told by loyal servants and old soldiers who remembered the great king. Penelope never stopped believing that her husband would one day return. Though many assumed Odysseus had died during the war, she remained patient, keeping hope alive even when the years seemed endless. As the Greek ships filled their sails with the morning wind, Odysseus walked along the deck, speaking quietly with his trusted companions. "We have survived the greatest war of our age," he said. "Now let us return safely to those who have waited for us." His men smiled with relief. Many dreamed of embracing their children. Others imagined the familiar shores of home. For the first time in many years, peace seemed close enough to touch. The fleet left the ruined city behind and sailed into the open sea beneath clear blue skies. The water sparkled in the sunlight. Gentle waves carried the ships forward, and a cool breeze filled the sails. Some sailors sang songs of victory, while others offered prayers of thanks to the gods. Odysseus stood silently at the front of his ship, watching the endless horizon. Something deep within him urged caution. He had learned long ago that the sea could change its mood without warning. And above the world, on the snowy peaks of Mount Olympus, the immortal gods watched the journeys of men. Some admired Odysseus for his wisdom. Others remembered old insults and wounded pride. Among them was Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea. Soon, a single act would earn Odysseus the anger of this powerful god. From that moment onward, every storm, every wave, and every distant island would become another trial in the greatest journey ever told. The road home had begun, but Ithaca was still unimaginably far away. The first days at sea passed peacefully. The wind was steady, the waves were gentle, and the fleet moved swiftly across the open water. Every sunrise brought fresh hope. After years of war, the sailors finally believed that fortune had turned in their favor. At night, they gathered on the decks of their ships beneath a sky filled with countless stars. They shared stories of Troy, laughed over old memories, and spoke of the homes waiting for them beyond the horizon. Odysseus listened more than he spoke. His eyes often remained fixed on the sea, as though searching for something hidden beyond the waves. He had spent enough years on dangerous journeys to know that peace could vanish in a single moment. Before long, his fears proved true. One afternoon, the bright skies slowly darkened. The wind that had carried the ships so gently began to howl. Thick clouds rolled across the heavens, swallowing the sunlight. The calm sea transformed into a restless ocean as towering waves rose higher with every passing minute. A flash of lightning split the sky. Moments later, thunder crashed across the sea with such force that even the bravest sailors fell silent. "Lower the sails!" Odysseus commanded. The crew rushed into action. Some climbed the masts, while others struggled to control the heavy steering oars. Rain poured down in sheets, making the wooden decks slippery beneath their feet. The storm showed no mercy. The ships were tossed like leaves upon the water. Waves crashed over the sides, filling the decks with seawater. Sailors worked desperately with buckets to keep their vessels from sinking. Hour after hour, they fought against the sea. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had passed, but the fleet was no longer together. Many ships had disappeared into the endless distance. Some had been driven far from their course. Others were nowhere to be seen. Odysseus gathered the ships that remained and continued the journey, hoping to find food, fresh water, and a place where his exhausted men could rest. Several days later, land appeared on the horizon. Green hills rose above a peaceful coastline, and smoke drifted from distant homes. It was the land of the Cyclops. The weary sailors were relieved. After the hardships of the storm, the island seemed like a gift from the gods. At first, everything went well. The Greeks entered the coastal town, defeated its defenders, and collected food, livestock, and supplies for the voyage ahead. Odysseus watched carefully. He knew that victory often tempted men into making foolish choices. "We have enough," he told his companions. "Take what we need and return to the ships. We should leave before our enemies can gather their strength." Many of the sailors nodded, but others were carried away by their success. They ignored their king's warning. Instead of leaving, they remained on the shore, celebrating their victory with food and drink. Hours passed. Meanwhile, survivors from the town had ridden inland, calling for help from neighboring villages. Soon, hundreds of skilled warriors marched toward the coast. Their shields gleamed beneath the morning sun. Their horses thundered across the open fields. By the time the Greeks realized the danger, it was already too late. The Cyclops attacked with great force. Spears filled the air. Bronze swords clashed against heavy shields. The quiet shoreline became a battlefield once again. Odysseus fought bravely beside his men, shouting orders and leading the defense. But the enemy was too numerous. One by one, brave companions fell. Many who had survived 10 years of war at Troy now lost their lives because they had stayed too long on an unfamiliar shore. At last, Odysseus ordered a retreat. The surviving sailors rushed back to their ships, pushing them into the water as enemy arrows flew overhead. The fleet escaped, but at a terrible cost. As the island faded into the distance, no songs were heard upon the decks. Only silence remained. Each empty place where a sailor had once stood reminded the survivors that the journey home would demand far greater sacrifices than they had ever imagined. For many days after leaving the land of the Cyclops, the sea remained quiet. No one spoke much. The loss of their companions weighed heavily upon every heart. The laughter that had once echoed across the ships had disappeared, replaced by the endless sound of waves striking the wooden hulls. Odysseus often walked the deck alone. He blamed himself for every man who had fallen. Although he had warned his crew to leave quickly, he believed that a king shared the burden of every life under his command. Still, there was no turning back. The only path lay forward. Soon, another powerful wind began to blow across the sea. This time, it did not bring rain or thunder. Instead, it carried the ships far away from their intended course. Day after day, they drifted across unfamiliar waters until the stars themselves seemed different. At last, a strange coastline appeared in the distance. Unlike the rocky islands they had passed before, this land looked peaceful and inviting. Green fields stretched toward the hills, colorful flowers covered the valleys, and gentle streams flowed through the countryside. There were no walls, no armies, no signs of war, only silence. The sailors believed they had finally found a place where they could rest without fear. Odysseus ordered the ships to anchor near the shore. "We know nothing about these people," he said. "We will be careful." He selected 3 trusted companions to explore the incident while the others remained with the ships. The men walked inland beneath the warm afternoon sun. Before long, they encountered the island's peaceful inhabitants. These people welcomed strangers with gentle smiles. They carried no weapons. Instead, they offered the renters a strange golden fruit that grew upon the island. It was called the lotus. The fruit looked sweet and smelled pleasant. The explorers accepted the gift without suspicion. As soon as they tasted it, something remarkable happened. Their fear disappeared. Their worries faded away. Even the memory of their long journey began to vanish like morning mist beneath the rising sun. They no longer wished to return to the ships. They no longer cared about Ithaca. Home became nothing more than a distant dream that slowly slipped from their minds. Instead, they wished only to remain upon the island forever, eating the lotus and living without care. Hours passed. When the explorers failed to return, Odysseus grew concerned. Taking several loyal sailors with him, he went ashore to search for them. He found the missing men sitting peacefully among the islanders, smiling as though they had forgotten the world beyond the valley. "My friends," Odysseus said, "our ships are waiting." The men simply shook their heads. "There is no need to leave," one of them replied. "Everything we could ever want is here." Odysseus immediately understood that the fruit had enchanted them. Without hesitation, he ordered his sailors to seize the men and carry them back to the shore. The enchanted sailors protested. They begged to stay. Some even struggled against their rescuers. But Odysseus refused to leave anyone behind. His men tied the affected sailors securely to the benches inside the ships until the strange influence of the lotus could wear away. Before raising the sails, Odysseus gathered the entire crew. "Remember this day," he said. "There are dangers greater than swords and storms. Some enemies do not attack the body. They steal the will to continue. If we ever forget our purpose, we will never see our homes again." The sailors nodded silently. As the ships sailed away from the island of the Lotus Eaters, the peaceful shore slowly disappeared behind them. No one knew what strange land awaited next. But far beyond the horizon, a lonely island of towering cliffs hid a creature whose name would be remembered for thousands of years. A giant with a single eye. The Cyclops. For 2 days and 2 nights, the ships sailed across the open sea. The wind was steady, and the waves carried them toward an unfamiliar group of islands. In the distance, steep mountains rose from the water, their rocky cliffs shining beneath the morning sun. As the fleet drew closer, Odysseus noticed something unusual. There were no harbors crowded with fishing boats. No smoke rose from villages. No sound of people working in the fields. The island seemed untouched by ordinary life. Nearby lay a smaller island where wild goats wandered freely among the hills. The sailors landed there first, hunting enough food to satisfy their hunger after many difficult days at sea. That evening, they built small fires along the shore and shared a quiet meal. As darkness covered the sea, Odysseus stared toward the larger island across the narrow stretch of water. He could see smoke rising high above the cliffs. Someone, or something, lived there. Curiosity filled his mind. At sunrise, Odysseus chose 12 of his bravest companions to explore the mysterious island. Before leaving, he instructed the rest of the crew to remain with the ships until they returned. The small party crossed the water in a single boat. The island was beautiful, yet strangely silent. Thick forests covered the hillsides. Fresh streams flowed between the rocks. Wild sheep and goats grazed peacefully in the valleys. But nowhere could they find fields, roads, or signs of a city. Following a narrow path into the hills, they soon discovered an enormous cave. Outside the entrance stood wooden fences built from huge crew trunks. Behind them grazed hundreds of sheep and goats, far larger than any the Greeks had ever seen. Inside the cave were baskets overflowing with cheese, clay jars filled with fresh milk, and wooden racks used for storing food. Several sailors looked at the supplies with excitement. "Let us take what we need and leave," one of them whispered. "Whoever lives here is surely away tending the flocks." Others quickly agreed. "There is enough food here for all of us. We should return before the owner comes back." But Odysseus remained where he stood. He carefully examined the enormous cave. Nothing about it seemed ordinary. The tools were far too large for any normal man. The entrance itself was tall enough for a giant. Still, his curiosity overcame his caution. "I wish to meet the owner of this place," Odysseus said. "Perhaps he will welcome strangers according to the ancient customs of hospitality." His companions exchanged uneasy glances. They had traveled long enough to know that unknown lands often hid unexpected dangers. Yet none wished to abandon their king. They waited inside the cave as the afternoon slowly passed. Then, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Heavy footsteps echoed across the hillside. The sheep outside suddenly became restless. A massive shadow fell across the entrance of the cave. Slowly, a gigantic figure appeared. He was unlike any creature the Greeks had ever seen. His body was as large as a towering oak tree. His arms were thick as great branches. In the center of his forehead burned a single, enormous eye. Without effort, he rolled a gigantic stone across the entrance of the cave, a stone so heavy that 20 ordinary men could never have moved it. At that moment, Odysseus and his companions realized the terrible truth. They were trapped. And the owner of the cave was no ordinary shepherd. He was a Cyclops. The enormous Cyclops moved slowly through the cave, paying no attention to the frightened strangers hiding in the shadows. He began his evening work as though it were an ordinary day. One by one, he milked his great sheep and goats, filling huge wooden buckets with fresh milk. He separated the young animals from the older ones and stacked large wheels of cheese along the walls of the cave. Only when his work was finished did he finally notice the visitors. The giant turned toward them. His single eye narrowed. His deep voice echoed through the cave like distant thunder. "Who are you?" The question filled the silent cave. No one answered at first. Odysseus stepped forward. Though fear gripped his heart, he refused to show it. "We are Greeks," he said respectfully. "Our ships were blown off course after the war at Troy. We seek only food, shelter, and the kindness that travelers are owed. We ask you to honor the sacred law of hospitality." The Cyclops stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not the laughter of a friendly host. It was harsh and cold. "You speak of laws," the giant replied. "I care nothing for the laws of men or even the commands of the gods. I live by my own strength." Odysseus realized at once that this creature feared neither justice nor mercy. The Cyclops suddenly asked another question. "Where is your ship?" Odysseus understood the danger immediately. If the giant discovered the ships waiting along the shore, every man in his crew would be lost. So he answered with a lie. "Our ship was destroyed by the sea. We alone survived." The Cyclops gave no reply. Instead, he reached forward with frightening speed. Before anyone could react, his giant hands seized 2 of Odysseus's companions. The sailors cried out in terror. The others rushed forward, but they were powerless against the giant's incredible strength. The Cyclops showed no pity. He killed the two men as easily as a man might break dry branches. The remaining sailors stood frozen in horror. They had fought in great battles. They had faced armies and storms. Yet nothing had prepared them for this nightmare. When the giant had finished, he lay down beside his flock and quickly fell asleep. His heavy breathing echoed throughout the cave. No one slept that night. The sailors gathered around Odysseus, whispering in fear. "We must attack him while he sleeps," one man urged. "If we strike together, perhaps we can kill him." Odysseus looked toward the enormous stone blocking the entrance. Even if the Cyclops died, none of them could move that stone. They would remain trapped inside until hunger claimed them all. "No," Odysseus whispered. "There must be another way." Throughout the long night, he watched the sleeping giant. He studied every corner of the cave. He searched for anything that might offer hope. Near the sheepfold lay a massive wooden staff, freshly cut from an olive tree. The Cyclops had planned to use it as a walking stick once it had dried. Odysseus stared at the great piece of wood. Slowly, an idea began to form. Not a plan of strength, a plan of cleverness. He quietly gathered his companions. "We cannot defeat this monster by force," he said, "but perhaps we can defeat him with our minds." For the first time since entering the cave, a small spark of hope returned to the faces of the frightened sailors. Odysseus had begun to devise a plan, one that would test every ounce of his courage, patience, and intelligence. Morning arrived, but it brought no relief. The Cyclops awoke with the first light of dawn. As before, he calmly milked his sheep and goats, moving through his daily routine as though nothing unusual had happened. Then, without warning, he seized two more of Odysseus's companions. The sailors cried out in terror, but there was nothing they could do. The giant showed no mercy. When he had finished, he rolled the enormous stone away from the entrance just long enough to lead his flock outside. As soon as the last sheep had passed, he pushed the stone back into place, sealing the cave once again. The Greeks were trapped. Silence filled the cave. Every man looked to Odysseus. Their lives now depended entirely upon his wisdom. Without wasting a moment, Odysseus set his plan into motion. He chose the thick olive wood staff lying near the wall. With the help of his companions, he cut off one end and sharpened it into a long, pointed stake. Then they hardened the tip in the glowing embers of the fire until it became as tough as iron. Finally, they hid the weapon beneath piles of straw so the Cyclops would not notice it when he returned. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, heavy footsteps echoed outside the cave once more. The Cyclops returned with his flock. He rolled the great stone across the entrance and repeated his evening work. When everything was quiet, Odysseus stepped forward, carrying a large skin of strong wine. It had been given to him earlier in the journey, and he had wisely saved it. Holding it out respectfully, he said, "Great Cyclops, accept this wine as a gift from your guests." The giant had never tasted such a drink. He lifted the skin and swallowed it eagerly. A smile spread across his face. "Wonderful," he boomed. "Give me more." Odysseus offered him another drink, then another. With every mouthful, the Cyclops became more cheerful. His speech grew slower. His movements became clumsy. Before long, he looked down at the clever Greek and asked, "Tell me your name, little man. I will give you a gift before I eat you." Odysseus smiled calmly. "My name," he replied, "is Nobody." The giant nodded. "Very well, Nobody. My gift is that I shall eat you last." Moments later, the Cyclops collapsed onto the cave floor. The powerful wine had overcome him. His loud snores shook the walls. Odysseus immediately signaled his companions. Together they pulled the sharpened stake from its hiding place and thrust its tip deep into the fire until it glowed bright red. Then, gathering all their strength, they lifted the burning stake. "Now," Odysseus whispered. With one mighty effort, they drove the blazing wood toward the Cyclops. The giant awoke with a deafening roar that echoed across the island. He struggled wildly in pain, throwing rocks and wooden buckets across the cave. His cries carried far into the night. Other Cyclops heard the noise and called from outside. "What is wrong, Polyphemus?" they shouted. "Who is hurting you?" The giant screamed in agony. "Nobody is attacking me. Nobody is trying to kill me." The other Cyclops fell silent. "If nobody is harming you," they answered, "then your suffering must come from the gods. We cannot help you." Believing their companion had lost his senses, they walked away into the darkness. Inside the cave, Odysseus knew the hardest part was still ahead. The giant was alive. The entrance remained blocked. And sunrise would decide whether the Greeks escaped or perished forever. Chapter 2. The Keeper of the Winds. The ships of Odysseus sailed away from the island of the Cyclops, leaving behind the towering cliffs and the furious cries of Polyphemus. For many days the sea remained calm. A gentle wind carried the fleet across sparkling blue waters, and for the first time in weeks, the sailors allowed themselves to believe that their worst trials were over. The stolen sheep provided fresh food, and the men slowly recovered from the horrors they had witnessed inside the giant's cave. Yet Odysseus could not forget the final words of Polyphemus. He remembered the prayer offered to Poseidon, the mighty ruler of the sea. Though nothing unusual appeared upon the water, Odysseus felt that unseen eyes were watching every movement of his ships. Still, the voyage continued. One bright morning, a lonely island appeared on the horizon. Unlike the wild lands they had visited before, this island looked peaceful and orderly. Gentle hills rose above green forests, and cool streams flowed into quiet bays where the sea was perfectly still. As the fleet approached, a strange calm settled over the water. Not even the smallest wave disturbed the surface. It was as though the winds themselves had chosen to rest. Odysseus ordered the ships to anchor. His companions stepped ashore carefully, expecting another unknown danger. Instead, they were greeted by a group of friendly servants who welcomed them with smiles and offered fresh water and food. The strangers explained that this island belonged to Aeolus, the ruler appointed by the gods to govern all the winds of the world. Odysseus had heard stories of this mysterious king. It was said that every breeze, every storm, and every powerful gale crossed the seas only with Aeolus's permission. Soon, Odysseus was invited into the great hall of the island. There he met Aeolus, who received him with kindness and respect. The king had already heard tales of the Trojan War and of the clever Greek whose wisdom had helped bring it to an end. For nearly a month, Odysseus remained on the island as an honored guest. Each evening, he told stories of the long war, the fall of Troy, and the difficult journey across the sea. Aeolus listened with great interest. When at last the time came for Odysseus to continue his voyage, the king decided to offer him a remarkable gift. Calling for a strong leather bag, Aeolus carefully trapped within it every wild and dangerous wind that could drive a ship off course. Only the gentle west wind was left free to guide the fleet safely toward Ithaca. Handing the tightly bound bag to Odysseus, Aeolus spoke seriously. "Guard this gift with your life. Do not allow anyone to open it until your ships have safely reached home." Odysseus thanked the king with deep gratitude. He placed the mysterious bag securely inside his own ship, keeping its secret known only to himself. As the fleet departed, a soft and steady breeze filled every sail. For the first time since leaving Troy, Ithaca seemed truly within reach. Day after day, the familiar stars returned to the night sky. the sailors began recognizing the waters near their homeland. Then, one evening, just as the sun disappeared below the horizon, Odysseus saw it. Far away in the distance, the lights of Ithaca. Home was finally within sight. But while the king stood quietly at the helm, exhausted from many sleepless days, some of his companions began staring suspiciously at the mysterious leather bag hidden beside him. They whispered among themselves, "What treasure could our king be hiding?" The lights of Ithaca shimmered faintly on the horizon. After years of war and countless hardships at sea, home was finally within reach. The sailors could hardly contain their excitement. Some pointed toward the distant shoreline, certain they recognized the familiar hills of their homeland. Others spoke joyfully of the families who had waited so long for their return. Odysseus remained at the helm. For 9 days and 9 nights, he had stayed awake, guiding the fleet without rest. He trusted no one else to steer the ships through the final stretch of the journey. The leather bag given by Aeolus rested safely beside him. Inside it were the wild winds of the world, tightly bound by the king of the winds himself. Only the gentle west wind remained free, carrying the fleet steadily toward Ithaca. At last, exhaustion overcame Odysseus. Believing the voyage nearly complete, he closed his eyes for what he thought would be only a few moments. The sea was calm, the wind was gentle. Nothing seemed capable of going wrong. But while their king slept, whispers spread among the crew. Several sailors gathered around the mysterious leather bag. One of them spoke quietly. "Our king has kept this bag hidden ever since we left Aeolus." Another nodded. "He has not allowed any of us to touch it." A third sailor frowned. "Perhaps it is filled with gold and silver. Perhaps Aeolus rewarded only Odysseus while the rest of us received nothing." The whispers soon became arguments. "We fought the same battles. We faced the Cyclops together. Why should our king keep all the treasure for himself?" Only a few loyal companions defended Odysseus. "He has never betrayed us," one man said. "If he keeps the bag closed, he must have a good reason." But greed has a way of drowning out wisdom. The suspicious sailors stepped closer. Carefully, they untied the strong leather cord that sealed the bag. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the bag burst open. A deafening roar exploded across the sea. The imprisoned winds rushed into the sky with unstoppable force. Wild storms spun around the ships. The calm ocean instantly became a raging battlefield of towering waves. The sails snapped violently. The masts groaned beneath the terrible wind. Odysseus awoke with a start. His eyes fell upon the open bag. In a single glance, he understood everything. "No!" he shouted. But it was already too late. The furious winds drove the fleet backward with incredible speed. The distant lights of Ithaca disappeared into darkness. The ships were carried farther and farther away until even the outline of their homeland vanished beyond the horizon. For hours, the storm raged without mercy. At last, when the winds finally grew quiet, the battered fleet drifted helplessly upon unfamiliar waters. Before them lay a familiar island. Odysseus stared at it in silence. It was the island of Aeolus. Home had been only a few miles away. Now they had been blown all the way back to the beginning. The sailors lowered their heads in shame. Not a single man dared speak. They knew their own greed had stolen the victory that had been within their reach. The battered fleet slowly approached the island of Aeolus once again. Only a day earlier, the king of the winds had sent Odysseus away with his blessing, confident that the hero would soon reach Ithaca. Now the same ships returned, their sails torn and their crews filled with shame. Odysseus stepped ashore with a heavy heart. He entered Aeolus's great hall and bowed respectfully before the king. "My lord," he said, "disaster has struck us. While I slept, my men opened the bag you entrusted to me. The imprisoned winds escaped and drove us back across the sea. I ask for your help once more." Aeolus looked at him in silence. For a long moment, he studied Odysseus's face. Then he slowly shook his head. "If the gods have sent you back," he replied, "they must be against you." No ordinary misfortune could have undone a gift protected by divine power. Odysseus tried to explain. "My companions acted out of ignorance, not evil. Please show mercy." But Aeolus stood and turned away. "I cannot fight against the will of the gods," he said. "If Poseidon or another immortal has chosen to oppose you, I dare not interfere. Leave this island, Odysseus. I can do nothing more." His words fell like a heavy stone. Odysseus realized that no amount of pleading would change the king's mind. With quiet dignity, he thanked Aeolus for the kindness he had already shown and returned to the shore. The sailors watched him approach. From the expression on his face, they already knew the answer. No one spoke as they pushed the ships back into the sea. The gentle breeze that had once carried them toward home was gone. Now they sailed without guidance, drifting across endless waters beneath an empty sky. Days turned into weeks. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. Food became scarce. The men grew tired and discouraged. Some blamed themselves for opening the bag. Others blamed fate. But Odysseus refused to surrender. Every morning he stood at the front of his ship, searching the horizon for the next land. Finally, after many difficult days, dark mountains appeared in the distance. As the fleet sailed closer, they saw a broad harbor surrounded by towering cliffs. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden between high walls of rock. Inside, the water looked perfectly calm. The sailors sighed with relief. After weeks upon the open sea, the harbor seemed like the safest place they had ever seen. Most of the ships entered the quiet bay and anchored close together. But Odysseus hesitated. Something about the place troubled him. Instead of sailing inside, he ordered his own ship to remain outside the harbor, fastening it securely to a rocky point near the entrance. His companions wondered why. The harbor appeared peaceful. There were no signs of danger. Still, Odysseus trusted the instinct that had saved him many times before. The three scouts followed a narrow path that climbed from the harbor into the hills. The air was still. No birds sang in the trees, and no voices echoed across the valleys. Everything seemed strangely quiet. After walking for some time, they came upon a broad road leading toward an enormous city surrounded by towering cliffs. It looked unlike any place they had ever seen. The houses were unusually large. The gates were carved from massive blocks of stone. Even the wells and fountains seemed far too big for ordinary people. As they entered the city, they noticed that the streets were almost empty. At last, they saw a young woman carrying a large water jar. She smiled politely and pointed toward a magnificent palace at the center of the city. "Our king and queen live there," she said. Believing they had found a peaceful kingdom, the scouts thanked her and continued on. The palace doors stood open. Inside, everything was enormous. Great tables stretched across the hall, and giant chairs stood beside roaring fireplaces. The men exchanged nervous glances. Before they could leave, a shadow fell over them. They turned around. Standing before them was the queen. She was no ordinary woman. She was as tall as a giant, her face fierce and terrifying. With a single cry, she summoned her husband. The king rushed into the hall. He was one of the Laestrygonians, a race of savage giants. Without a word, he seized one of the Greek scouts in his enormous hand. The other two men fled in terror. Behind them, the giant's roar echoed across the city. At once, countless Laestrygonian warriors poured from their homes. The hills shook beneath their footsteps. The two surviving scouts raced toward the harbor as fast as they could. "Run!" they shouted. "Giants! Giants!" The warning came too late. The Laestrygonians reached the cliffs overlooking the harbor. Instead of arrows, they hurled massive rocks the size of houses. The giant stones crashed into the trapped Greek ships below. Wood splintered. Masts snapped in half. Entire ships were crushed beneath the falling boulders. The narrow harbor became a deadly trap. With no room to turn around, the Greek vessels collided with one another as the giants continued their attack. Some ships sank almost immediately. Others broke apart against the cliffs. Sailors leaped into the water, hoping to escape. But the Laestrygonians waded into the sea like hunters entering a shallow stream. They seized men with their huge hands and carried them away. Only one ship escaped. It was Odysseus's. Because he had anchored outside the harbor, his vessel remained beyond the reach of the first attack. The moment he saw the disaster unfolding, Odysseus drew his sword. "Cut the ropes!" he shouted. His crew slashed through the lines holding the ship to the rocks. Every man grabbed an oar. With all their strength, they pulled the ship away from the deadly coast. Behind them, the harbor echoed with the sounds of crashing ships and desperate cries. When they finally reached the open sea, Odysseus looked back. His fleet was gone. Dozens of ships had been destroyed. Hundreds of loyal companions had been lost. Only his own vessel remained. The journey that had begun with a mighty fleet after the fall of Troy had now been reduced to a single ship, carrying only the few men who had survived. For many days, the single surviving ship drifted across the endless sea. The silence aboard was heavier than ever before. Where once dozens of ships had sailed together, only one remained. The men rarely spoke. Every face reflected the sorrow of those they had lost in the harbor of the Laestrygonians. Odysseus stood at the bow of the ship each morning, watching the horizon. Though grief weighed upon him, he knew he could not allow despair to overcome his crew. "If we are still alive," he told them, "then hope is still alive." His words gave the sailors a little strength. They continued rowing and sailing, trusting their king. Several days later, another island appeared. Unlike the land of the giants, this island was covered with thick forests and green hills. Birds circled peacefully overhead, and clear streams flowed from the mountains into the sea. It seemed quiet. Almost too quiet. The sailors landed on a sandy beach and rested after their long voyage. Fresh water was collected, fires were lit, and food was prepared. As night fell, the stars shone brightly above them. For the first time in many days, no enemy appeared. The next morning, Odysseus climbed a nearby hill to study the island. In the distance, he noticed thin columns of smoke rising above the trees. Someone lived there. He returned to the shore and gathered his companions. "We must discover who rules this island," he said. This time, he divided the crew into two groups. One group would remain behind to guard the ship. The other would explore the island. Lots were drawn. The task of exploration fell to Eurylochus, one of Odysseus's most trusted officers. Though brave, Eurylochus felt uneasy. There was something mysterious about the island that he could not explain. Still, he obeyed his king. With a small band of sailors, he followed a narrow path through the forest. The deeper they walked, the stranger the woods became. Tall trees blocked much of the sunlight. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and herbs. Yet the forest was not empty. Lions wandered quietly among the trees. Wolves emerged from the shadows. The sailors froze in fear. But instead of attacking, the wild animals gently approached them. Some wagged their tails like faithful dogs. Others rubbed against their legs as though welcoming old friends. "This is no ordinary place," Eurylochus whispered. The animals behaved as if they had once been human. Following the forest path, they finally reached a beautiful stone palace surrounded by blooming gardens. From inside came the sound of a woman singing. Her voice was soft and beautiful, echoing through the trees like a peaceful melody. The sailors looked at one another. The palace appeared welcoming. Yet Eurylochus could not shake the feeling that great danger waited beyond its doors. He hesitated. His companions stepped forward. The woman inside had already heard their footsteps, and she was about to welcome them inside. The great doors of the palace opened slowly. A beautiful woman stepped outside to greet the strangers. She smiled warmly, as though she had been expecting them. "I am Circe," she said. "Welcome, travelers. You must be tired after your long journey. Please, come inside and rest." Most of the sailors accepted her invitation without hesitation. The palace was bright and comfortable, filled with rich tapestries, polished tables, and the pleasant aroma of fresh bread and roasted meat. Circe served them food and sweet wine in golden cups. The hungry sailors ate gratefully, believing they had finally found a kind host. But hidden within the meal was a powerful enchantment. As soon as they finished eating, Circe quietly raised her wand. She spoke ancient words in a language none of the Greeks understood. A strange light filled the room. The sailors tried to stand, but their bodies suddenly felt weak. One by one, they began to change. Their hands became hooves. Their voices turned into frightened squeals. Within moments, they had been transformed into pigs. Though their minds remained human, they could no longer speak or fight. Circe calmly drove them into a large pen beside the palace, where many other enchanted animals already lived. Only one man had escaped, Eurylochus. At the last moment, fear had kept him from entering the palace. Hidden behind the trees, he had watched everything in horror. Without stopping, he ran back through the forest as fast as he could. When he reached the beach, he struggled to catch his breath. "The men," he gasped. "They're gone. Circe, she's a witch. She turned them into animals." The sailors stared at him in disbelief. Odysseus stepped forward. "Tell me exactly what happened." Eurylochus described every detail. The friendly welcome, the feast, the magic, the terrible transformation. When he finished, silence fell over the shore. No one wanted to return to the palace. "It's too dangerous," Eurylochus pleaded. "If you go, you'll never come back." But Odysseus shook his head. "I cannot abandon my companions." He fastened his sword to his belt and lifted his spear. Then, alone, he began walking toward the dark forest. Every step carried him closer to the mysterious palace of Circe. As he disappeared among the trees, the sailors watched in anxious silence. None of them knew whether they would ever see their king again. And deep within the enchanted forest, destiny was already preparing Odysseus for another trial, one that would test not only his courage, but also his wisdom against the power of ancient magic. Chapter 3. The Journey to the Underworld. The sea was calm once again. Only one ship remained. Where a proud fleet had once crossed the waters after the fall of Troy, now a single weathered vessel carried the last survivors of Odysseus's long journey. The men who still stood upon its deck had endured storms, giants, and terrible losses. Their faces were worn by hardship, yet their eyes remained fixed on one dream: home. Ithaca still waited somewhere beyond the endless sea. For several days, the wind carried them across quiet waters. No storms appeared, no strange islands rose from the horizon. Even the waves seemed gentle, as though the sea itself had grown tired of testing them. But Odysseus knew better. Peace upon the sea rarely lasted. One morning, a familiar island slowly appeared through the morning mist. Its green hills, thick forests, and rocky shoreline stirred memories that none of the sailors wished to remember. It was the island of Circe. Many months earlier, they had arrived here as strangers. Some had been transformed into animals by the powerful enchantress. Others had believed they would never leave alive. Yet through courage, wisdom, and the help of the gods, Odysseus had broken Circe's magic and earned her respect. Now fate had brought them back once more. The ship entered the quiet bay. No soldiers guarded the shore. No monsters waited among the trees. Only silence welcomed them. Odysseus stepped onto the beach first. His companions followed carefully, their hands resting upon their swords. The forest looked peaceful. Birds sang among the branches. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild flowers through the air. It was difficult to believe that such a beautiful place had once hidden so much danger. They followed the familiar path through the woods until the great stone palace appeared before them. Its doors stood open. Waiting at the entrance was Circe. She smiled calmly as Odysseus approached. "I knew you would return," she said. Odysseus bowed respectfully. "Our journey is not yet finished," he replied. "We have escaped many dangers, but the road home still remains hidden from us." Circe studied him for a long moment. "You have changed," she said quietly. "The sea has taken much from you." Odysseus glanced toward his companions. "Too much." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Circe's expression became serious. "There is something you must know." The sailors gathered closer. The warmth of the morning seemed to fade as the enchantress continued. "No matter how brave you are, no matter how wisely you lead, you cannot reach Ithaca unless you first make another journey." Odysseus frowned. "What journey?" Circe looked toward the western horizon. Her voice became almost a whisper. "You must sail beyond the lands of men, beyond the setting sun, beyond every place known to the living." The sailors exchanged uneasy glances. Even the wind seemed to stop. Finally, Circe spoke the words none of them expected. "You must travel to the Underworld." A heavy silence fell over the palace. Several sailors lowered their heads. Others stared at Circe in disbelief. No living man willingly entered the realm of the dead. Yet Circe's eyes showed no uncertainty. "It is the only path left to you," she said. "There you must seek the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias. Only he can reveal the dangers that still lie ahead, and only his wisdom can guide you safely home." Odysseus stood motionless. He had faced monsters stronger than any man. He had outwitted a Cyclops. He had escaped giants and storms. But this journey would be unlike any before. It would lead him into a kingdom from which few souls ever returned. And before another sunrise, he would have to choose whether to step onto that impossible path. The hall remained silent after Circe spoke those dreadful words. No one moved. The crackling fire was the only sound that broke the stillness. The sailors looked from one face to another, hoping someone would deny what they had just heard. But Circe stood calmly before them. Her expression showed neither fear nor doubt. She knew the path that destiny had chosen for Odysseus. At last, Odysseus broke the silence. "You ask me to journey into the land of the dead," he said. "Has any living man ever returned from such a place?" Circe lowered her eyes for a moment. "Very few," she answered. "But you are not like other men. The gods have marked your fate. Your road is difficult, yet it is not closed." Odysseus slowly nodded. He understood that arguing with destiny would change nothing. "If this is the only road to Ithaca," he said quietly, "then I will follow it." The sailors looked at their king in disbelief. Eurylochus stepped forward. "My lord," he said, "we have crossed endless seas. We have survived monsters and giants. Must we now challenge death itself?" Odysseus placed a reassuring hand on his companion's shoulder. "We do not seek death," he replied. "We seek the way home." Circe watched the exchange with quiet respect. Then she began explaining everything they would need for the journey. "You must sail to the farthest edge of Oceanus," she said. "There you will find a land where sunlight barely reaches the earth. It is a place wrapped in mist where the rivers of the underworld meet. She walked toward a large wooden table and unrolled an ancient map. Her finger traced a path across seas no Greek sailor had ever dared to cross. "When you arrive," she continued, "dig a trench in the ground. Pour offerings of milk mixed with honey, sweet wine, and fresh water. Then sacrifice a black ram and a black ewe. Their blood will call the spirits of the dead." Every sailor listened carefully. No one wished to make even the smallest mistake. Circe's voice became even more serious. "When the spirits appear, many will rush toward you. Some will beg to speak. Others will try to drink from the sacrifice." She looked directly at Odysseus. "Do not allow them. Draw your sword. Keep every spirit away until Tiresias himself arrives. Only after the prophet has spoken may the others approach." Odysseus repeated each instruction quietly, committing every detail to memory. One forgotten word, one careless action, could mean remaining in the underworld forever. The rest of the day was spent preparing for the voyage. Circe filled the ship with fresh food, clean water, and jars of fine wine. She provided strong ropes, warm cloaks, and every supply she believed they would need. As evening settled over the island, the sailors carried the last of the provisions aboard. No songs were sung, no laughter echoed across the shore. Each man understood that tomorrow's voyage would carry them farther from the world of the living than any mortal had ever willingly traveled. Before sunrise, Odysseus stood alone beside the sea. The stars reflected upon the dark water. He thought of Ithaca, of Penelope, of Telemachus. Every step of this terrible journey had been for them. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, he gave the order to raise the sails. The voyage to the underworld had begun. The ship slipped quietly away from Circe's island. A gentle breeze filled the sail, but none of the sailors felt comfort. Behind them, the green hills of the island slowly disappeared into the morning mist. Ahead lay an ocean that few dared to imagine. For several days, they sailed without seeing another ship. The sea grew darker with every passing sunrise. The bright blue water turned gray, then almost black beneath the shadow of heavy clouds. Even the air felt different, colder and strangely still. No birds circled above the mast. No dolphins followed the bow. It was as though all living creatures avoided these waters. The sailors whispered among themselves, "I have never seen the sea so silent. It feels as if the world itself has ended." Odysseus heard their fears, but he said nothing. He stood at the helm, watching the horizon. Circe's directions guided every decision he made. On the fifth day, a thick mist began to rise from the sea. It surrounded the ship until the sailors could barely see the ends of the deck. The sun disappeared behind the gray veil. Day and night became almost impossible to tell apart. Only the steady sound of the waves reminded them that they were still moving forward. At last, a dark coastline emerged from the mist. Jagged cliffs stretched across the horizon like the broken teeth of a giant beast. No trees grew upon them. No green grass covered the rocks. Everything appeared lifeless. The wind carried neither the scent of flowers nor the salt of the sea. Instead, it brought a strange chill that seemed to pass through every layer of clothing and settle deep within the bones. "There," Odysseus said quietly, "we have reached the place." The sailors lowered the sail and dropped the anchor. For several moments, no one stepped ashore. The silence of the land was unsettling. It was not the peaceful silence of a quiet forest. It was the silence of a place where life no longer belonged. Finally, Odysseus climbed down from the ship. His companions followed, carrying the black ram and the black ewe that Circe had instructed them to bring. They walked across the barren ground until they found a lonely clearing beside a dark, slow-moving river. The water reflected no light. It flowed without a sound. Odysseus looked around carefully. Everything matched Circe's description. Without speaking, he drew his sword and began digging a shallow trench into the cold earth. The other sailors placed the offerings beside him. When the trench was complete, Odysseus poured milk mixed with honey into the earth. Next came sweet wine, then fresh water. Finally, he scattered barley over the ground as an offering to the spirits below. Each act was performed with great care. No one dared interrupt the ancient ritual. When everything was ready, Odysseus looked toward the dark sky and offered a solemn prayer. "If the spirits hear me," he said softly, "grant me the wisdom to complete this journey and return to my home." Then he prepared for the final sacrifice. The moment had come. The boundary between the world of the living and the kingdom of the dead was about to disappear. Odysseus took a deep breath. The cold wind swept across the barren land, carrying with it an eerie silence. His companions stood several steps behind him, their faces pale with fear. None of them had ever imagined they would witness a ritual performed at the very edge of the world. With steady hands, Odysseus completed the sacrifice exactly as Circe had instructed. The blood slowly flowed into the trench. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The sailors exchanged uncertain glances. Had the ritual failed? Then the earth trembled. Not violently, but gently, as though something deep beneath the ground had awakened. A freezing wind rushed across the clearing. The mist thickened until it surrounded them on every side. The daylight faded. The world became strangely dim, though the sun had not yet set. From somewhere beyond the river came a distant sound. It was neither the cry of an animal nor the voice of a man. It was a whisper, then another, and another. Soon, countless whispers filled the air. The sailors instinctively stepped backward. Some gripped their swords, others whispered prayers to the gods. Odysseus remained where he stood. Circe had warned him that fear would come first, then the spirits. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the mist. At first, they appeared as little more than drifting shadows, but as they drew nearer, they became clearer. Old men, young warriors, women carrying children, kings, farmers, sailors, people from every corner of the world. All of them moved silently toward the trench. Their pale eyes were fixed upon the blood. One spirit stretched out trembling hands. Another reached forward as though begging for help. The air grew colder with every passing moment. The sailors could barely breathe. One of them took another frightened step backward. "We should leave," he whispered. "This place is cursed." Odysseus turned without lowering his sword. "No." His voice was calm but firm. "We stay." He stepped directly in front of the trench. Drawing his bronze sword, he raised its shining blade before him. "No spirit shall cross," he declared. "Not until Tiresias comes." The restless shades continued gathering. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. The clearing was now surrounded by an endless sea of silent souls. Some stared with empty eyes. Others seemed filled with sorrow. A few appeared almost hopeful, as though the presence of living men reminded them of a world they had long ago lost. Yet none dared challenge the sword of Odysseus. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Minutes felt like hours. The mist swirled endlessly around the trench. Then, the crowd of spirits slowly began to part. The whispers faded. A path opened through the endless sea of shadows. Someone was coming. A single figure walked steadily toward the trench, carrying an air of quiet authority unlike any spirit that had appeared before. Though his eyes had been blind in life, his face reflected a wisdom untouched by death. Odysseus knew at once. The great prophet Tiresias had arrived. The spirit of Tiresias stopped before the trench. Unlike the restless shades surrounding him, he stood calmly, his presence commanding respect. Though his eyes had been blind in life, his face carried the quiet certainty of one who understood the designs of both gods and fate. Odysseus lowered his sword just enough to allow the prophet to approach. Tiresias drank from the sacrifice. Then he lifted his head. "Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, his voice echoing across the silent plain. "You have come seeking the road home." "I have," Odysseus replied, Tell me how I may return to Ithaca." The prophet remained silent for a moment before speaking. "You have earned the anger of Poseidon by blinding his son Polyphemus. Because of this, every mile of your journey will be hard. The sea itself will rise against you." The sailors exchanged uneasy glances. They had feared the curse was real. Now they heard it confirmed. "But do not lose hope," Tiresias continued. "The gods have not completely abandoned you. If you keep your wisdom, you will one day see your homeland again." Odysseus listened carefully. "What must I do?" Tiresias raised one hand. "When you reach the island of Thrinacia, you will find the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. No matter how hungry your men become, no matter how desperate your situation, they must not harm a single animal." The prophet's voice grew firmer. "If those cattle are left untouched, some among you may yet survive. But if they are killed," he paused, "your ship will be destroyed, your companions will perish, and you alone will continue the journey." The words struck Odysseus like a spear. He thought of the loyal men standing behind him. Many had followed him since the beginning of the Trojan War. Could he truly lose them all? Tiresias seemed to read his thoughts. "Some destinies cannot be escaped," he said quietly. "They can only be faced." Odysseus lowered his head. "Will I at least find peace when I return home?" The prophet answered slowly. "You will not return to the home you remember. Your palace will be filled with arrogant men who believe you are dead. They waste your wealth and compete for the hand of your faithful wife." At these words, Odysseus clenched his fists. "Penelope still waits for me? She does. She has remained loyal through every passing year." A faint smile appeared on Odysseus's face. It was the first hopeful news he had heard in many months. But Tiresias was not finished. "When you reach Ithaca, you must act with patience. Do not reveal yourself too soon. Watch your enemies. Choose your moment wisely." The prophet stepped back from the trench. "My task is complete. The rest of your fate belongs to your courage and to the choices you have yet to make." His form slowly began to fade into the surrounding mist. Before disappearing completely, he spoke one final sentence. "Remember, Odysseus, the greatest dangers ahead are not the monsters you will fight. They are the decisions you will make." The spirit vanished. The silence of the underworld returned. But Odysseus knew the journey was far from over. The prophet had revealed the future. Now he would have to survive it. For several moments, Odysseus stood in complete silence. The words of Tiresias echoed through his mind. The sacred cattle of Helios, the destruction of his ship, the suitors in his palace, and Penelope, still waiting after so many years. He tightened his grip on his sword. The future had been revealed, but it could not be changed by standing among the dead. As he turned to leave the trench, another spirit slowly approached. Unlike the others, she did not rush toward the sacrifice. She walked quietly, her face filled with both sadness and love. Odysseus stared at her in disbelief. His heart began to pound. It was his mother, Anticlea. He had left Ithaca believing she was alive. Now she stood before him as one of the dead. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Odysseus lowered his sword and allowed her to drink from the offering. As the strength returned to her spirit, she looked upon her son with gentle eyes. "My child." Odysseus could barely find his voice. "Mother, how did you come to this place? When I left for Troy, you were alive." A soft smile touched her face. "I was, but the years were long. I waited for your return, season after season. My strength slowly faded. It was not illness that claimed me, it was sorrow." Odysseus lowered his head. The words struck deeper than any wound he had received in battle. He had survived the greatest war of his age. He had defeated monsters and escaped impossible dangers. Yet he had not been there for the woman who had given him life. Tears filled his eyes. "And my father?" Anticlea answered gently. "He still lives. He has grown old. He spends his days working alone in the fields, refusing the comforts of the palace. He has never stopped hoping that you would return." Odysseus closed his eyes for a moment. "And Penelope? She remains faithful. Every day she mourns your absence. Many powerful men seek her hand, believing you have died, but she refuses them all. And Telemachus?" A look of pride crossed Anticlea's face. "He is no longer the child you left behind. He has become a brave young man. He protects your name as best he can." A quiet smile appeared on Odysseus's face. His son had grown into a man. Though they had never truly known one another, hope still remained. Overcome with emotion, Odysseus stepped forward, wishing only to embrace his mother once more. He reached out his arms, but they passed straight through her. Her spirit drifted like smoke. He tried again and again. Each time, she slipped through his grasp. Anticlea looked at him with kindness. "This is the sorrow of the dead," she said softly. "We can remember love, but we cannot hold it." The words broke Odysseus's heart. He stood motionless, accepting the truth that no mortal could change. Slowly, Anticlea's spirit began to fade. "Do not remain here too long," she whispered. "The world of the living still needs you. Go home, my son." Her form dissolved into the mist. The other spirits began gathering once more around the trench. Odysseus looked toward the waiting ship. He had come seeking a path home. Instead, he had found painful truths, precious hope, and the strength to continue. Without another word, he signaled his companions. The ritual was complete. It was time to leave the kingdom of the dead and face the trials that still awaited them upon the endless sea.